Just then, John heard a voice behind him. "John!" Emma's frantic call cut through the thick smoke, and he spun around, his heart dropping into his stomach. She was standing at the edge of the yard, her face pale and streaked with tears. "John, there's someone in the barn. Someone's inside the barn." John's blood ran cold. He dropped the shovel, his heart racing, and sprinted toward the barn, every muscle in his body screaming as he pushed himself harder, faster. Emma's words echoed in his ears. Someone inside the barn. His mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. What were they doing? Were they after more than just the animals? Chapter 1. The beginning of autumn. As the first crisp winds of autumn blew across the small, sleepy town of Oak Ridge, John and Emma went about their familiar routines. The large, weathered farmhouse they had lived in for over 50 years stood nestled among rows of fruit trees and a garden that Emma tended to with the care of someone who had grown up on the land. The couple had lived simple lives, filled with the steady rhythm of farming, and their days were always the same. Morning chores, tending to the animals, making sure the house was warm and welcoming, and preparing for the changing seasons. In the early morning light, the air smelled faintly of dew and fallen leaves. The garden, once full of ripe tomatoes, peppers, and squash, was now a patchwork of withered vines and fallen fruit. Emma, with her apron tied around her waist, bent low to the ground to pull the last of the carrots from the soil, her fingers stained with earth. John, ever practical, stood nearby, ensuring that the fences were secure and that the pigs, ducks, geese, and rabbits had enough water before the cold of winter set in. "It's almost time, Emma," John called softly, his voice steady despite the weariness in his bones. "We need to start getting the feed for the animals in order. No telling how bad the winter might be this year." Emma looked up, brushing her gray curls from her face. "I know, love. I've been thinking the same thing. I'll make sure we have enough canned vegetables, and we still have a fair bit of grain in the pantry. But I worry about the animals. The feed's running low, and we've been stretching it thinner and thinner each week." John nodded, his brow furrowing. The animals had always been their responsibility, and the thought of them going without made his heart heavy. They'd raised their livestock with patience and love, seeing each one as part of their family. The pigs grunted contentedly as they rooted through the dirt. The geese honked loudly in the nearby pond, and the cows lazily chewed their cud, oblivious to the growing tension in the air. "I'll go to the feed store tomorrow," John said. "I've heard the delivery's been a little delayed lately, but I'm sure it's nothing serious. I'll pick up some extra bags for the winter." Emma was unconvinced but nodded anyway. "All right, just be careful, John. If there's a problem with the supply, I don't want us to be caught without enough for the animals." John smiled reassuringly and patted her hand. "You worry too much. We've made it through worse before. I'll make sure everything's sorted out." They spent the rest of the morning working together, putting up vegetables for the winter in jars, stacking firewood in the barn, and preparing their small house for the colder months ahead. Their days were long but peaceful, and yet, as the day wore on, a sense of unease lingered in the air, the kind of unease that neither of them could name but both felt in their bones. By late afternoon, the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. Emma went to check on the animals as she did every evening. She was meticulous about their care, always looking for any signs of distress or illness. She found the cows huddled together under the large oak tree, the geese splashing happily in their pond, and the pigs snoozing in the corner of their pen. But as she walked through the yard, something felt off. The geese, normally loud and inquisitive, were quieter than usual, and the pigs seemed listless, lying in the mud without the usual energy. "John," Emma called, her voice tight with concern. "Come quick. Something's wrong with the animals." John rushed out from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. "What is it?" "Look at the pigs," she said, pointing toward the pen. "They're not moving much. And the geese. Something's not right with them either." John moved toward the pigs first, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the pen. He knelt down next to them, reaching out to gently pat one of the larger pigs. It stirred slightly, but then lay back down, eyes half closed. It's like they're sluggish, John muttered under his breath. Not like them at all. They're usually so full of life. Emma stood silently beside him, her brow furrowed in worry. Could it be the feed? She asked softly. Maybe it's not as fresh as it should be. Perhaps they're not getting enough of the right nutrients. John stood up, his face creased with concern. Maybe. I'll go check the feed tomorrow and see what's going on. But as he looked at the geese, a strange thought crossed his mind. The bags of feed in the barn had seemed fine when he checked them just a few weeks ago, but it was hard to remember exactly when he last replenished the supply. They had been getting by with what they had left, not realizing how quickly the feed could spoil or lose its nutritional value. We may have to take a trip to town, John said, his voice heavy with worry. The feed's running low, and if it's causing them to get sick, we can't afford to wait any longer. Emma nodded, her lips tight. I'll go make a list of what we need. We'll have to stock up for the winter. No telling what the weather will bring. That evening, as they sat down to a quiet meal, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on them both. They had lived through many winters on this farm, and they had always managed to make do with what they had. But the thought that something as simple as animal feed could cause so much trouble was unsettling. They had always prided themselves on being self-sufficient, but this felt like a new challenge, one they hadn't faced before. John set his fork down and looked across the table at Emma, his eyes filled with determination. We'll figure this out. We always do. Emma smiled softly, her worry lines softening for just a moment. I know, John, but let's not wait too long. We need to get ahead of this before it gets any worse. The days following that conversation were filled with urgency. John and Emma knew they had to act quickly to secure enough feed for the animals before the colder months set in. The next morning, John set out to town, hoping that the feed store would have what they needed. As he walked down the dusty road toward the village, his mind raced with possibilities. What if there was a problem with the supply chain? What if the feed was already in short supply? Emma stayed behind, tending to the animals and keeping a watchful eye on the garden. But as the hours stretched on, she began to feel the same sense of unease that had settled in John's chest. Something didn't feel right. John didn't return until late in the afternoon. When he finally pulled up the driveway, Emma was waiting for him, her hands folded anxiously in front of her. Well, she asked, unable to hide her worry. John didn't answer right away. He opened the truck and unloaded the bags of feed. His face was pale, and Emma could see the tension in his posture. It's worse than I thought, John said slowly. The feed store's out of stock on everything. They've been having supply problems for weeks now. I managed to get the last of their feed, but it's not enough to last us through the winter. Emma's heart sank. What do we do now? John exhaled heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. We'll have to find a new source. I'm not sure where we'll get it from, but I'll figure it out. We can't let the animals go without. And with that, the quiet certainty of their life together was shaken. A problem that seemed small at first had now become a major challenge. And in the back of their minds, both John and Emma knew that this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The clouds gather. The next morning arrived colder than the day before. A thin layer of frost covered the garden, and the early sunlight barely managed to pierce through the thick clouds hanging low in the sky. John woke early, as was his habit, to begin the morning chores. The air was sharp, and the ground was hard underfoot as he made his way to the barn. Despite the chill, the old familiar rhythm of life on the farm comforted him. Feeding the animals, checking on their health, ensuring everything was in order. But the peace he normally felt was not there today. It had been missing ever since he returned from town the day before. The feed issue weighed heavily on his mind. He had hoped to get a better supply, to stock up for the long winter months. But instead, he found himself standing in front of empty shelves, struggling to make sense of the situation. The feed store had been out of stock for everything he needed, and the warning signs had been clear: the shortage of supplies, the growing difficulty in acquiring essentials. It was a problem no one had foreseen, and now he was left with a limited supply of animal feed that would not last long. As John made his way to the chicken coop, his thoughts wandered to Emma. She had taken the news hard the day before, trying to remain hopeful as she continued to care for the animals. She had insisted that they would find a way through this, but John could sense her worry. He knew it was affecting her more than she let on. Emma had always been the rock of their home, the heart of their little farm, and her gentle hands and nurturing spirit had kept their world running smoothly for so many years. Seeing her anxious, as he had yesterday, had been unsettling. When John reached the chicken coop, the sound of the hens clucking greeted him. He opened the door and stepped inside, his boots crunching on the straw-covered floor. The chickens seemed healthy enough, pecking around for whatever food they could find. But something about their movements seemed off. They weren't as lively as usual, and some of them were standing quietly in corners, as though they were waiting for something. John took a deep breath, bending down to check the trough. The grain inside was low, but it wasn't empty. He tossed a handful of feed into the trough, watching as the hens eagerly rushed forward. Yet, the sight of the quiet chickens lingered in his mind. His heart tightened as he thought back to the pigs and the geese from the day before. Could it be that they were all somehow connected? Could the lack of proper nutrition already be affecting the entire flock of animals? By the time he finished in the barn, the first real snowflakes of the season had begun to fall. It was too early for snow, but the weather didn't seem to care. The wind picked up, and soon the snowflakes were swirling around him, coating the ground in a dusting of white. John turned to head back to the house, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his breath clouding in the cold air. When he reached the front door, Emma was waiting for him, her expression unreadable. "Did you check on the animals?" she asked, her voice steady, though John could hear the concern beneath the calm exterior. "I did," he replied, trying to sound reassuring. They're not in bad shape, but there's something off. The pigs and geese aren't acting like themselves. Even the chickens are quieter than usual." Emma's face tightened with worry. "Do you think it's the feed? Could it be bad already?" John hesitated before responding. "I don't know. It's possible. But I think it might be more than that. There's something in the air, Emma. Something's not right, and I don't like it." Emma reached out, taking his weathered hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "We'll figure it out, John. We always do." She wasn't as convinced as she tried to sound. John could see the doubt in her eyes, though she didn't want to voice it. They had been through tough times before, droughts, floods, even a fire a few years ago. But this felt different. The animals were more than just livestock to them. They were family, and watching them suffer without knowing exactly why was a new kind of fear. "Maybe I should go back into town today," John said, his mind racing with possibilities. "I'll speak to the farmers and see if anyone else is having trouble getting feed. If this is a bigger issue, we need to know." Emma nodded. "Be careful, John. You know the weather's getting worse." "But yes, it's a good idea. We need to find some answers." John kissed her forehead and promised to return as soon as he could. He stepped out of the house, pulling his coat tightly around him, and made his way down the long driveway, his boots crunching in the snow. The wind howled now, and the snow began to fall harder, clinging to his clothes and stinging his face. As he walked toward town, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut. There was a sense of impending trouble in the air. The storm wasn't just weather-related. It felt like something deeper, something unseen, was approaching. The thought of running out of food for the animals gnawed at him. He didn't know what they would do if it came to that. They couldn't afford to lose any of them. Not now. The town was only a short walk away, but the snow made the journey feel much longer. By the time John reached the main road, the streets were nearly empty. A few people trudged through the snow, their heads down, their movements quick. John passed the bakery and the hardware store, both of which had signs in their windows that read, "closed," or "out of stock." He wondered how long it would take for the whole town to feel the ripple effects of the supply issues. When he reached the feed store, he found the door slightly ajar, a bell ringing above him as he stepped inside. The store, normally bustling with activity this time of year, was eerily quiet. A few bags of feed were stacked in the back corner, but it was clear that the shelves were almost bare. The owner of the store, a middle-aged man named Frank, looked up from behind the counter when he saw John. "Well, if it isn't John Stevens," Frank said with a forced smile. "What brings you in today?" "I need feed," John replied, his voice tight. "You've got any left? The animals are running low, and I need to make sure they're taken care of for the winter." Frank's smile faded, and he gestured to the sparse shelves. "I'm afraid we've been having trouble with our suppliers. Everything's backordered. I don't know when we'll get more in, but I've got a couple bags left that I can sell you. Not enough for the whole season, though." John's stomach sank. "How long until you get a new shipment?" Frank shook his head. "Could be weeks, could be longer. No one knows. It's a mess, John." John turned away, feeling the weight of the situation settling on him. The reality was starting to hit hard. It wasn't just a local problem. This was going to affect everyone, and there was no telling how long it would take to fix. He had a limited supply of feed left at the farm, and it wouldn't last more than a couple of weeks if they were lucky. He needed to act fast. "All right," John said, looking at the bags in the corner. "I'll take what you've got. How much for the rest?" Frank gave him a price that John reluctantly accepted, knowing that it would have to do for now. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. As John left the store, the wind had picked up even more, the snow now falling in thick, swirling sheets. The walk back to the farm felt even longer, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. What would they do if the feed ran out? Would they have to sell some of the animals, or worse, let them go? He didn't know the answer yet, but he knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. When John finally returned to the farm, he found Emma waiting for him at the door, her face anxious but hopeful. "I didn't find much," John said, his voice low. "The store's out, and the next shipment's not coming for weeks, if at all." Emma took a deep breath, her face pale. "What now?" John hesitated. "I'll keep looking for a solution. I won't let them go hungry, Emma. I promise you that." The storm outside raged, and as the wind howled around the house, the feeling of impending danger grew stronger in the air. The farm, once a sanctuary of peace and comfort, now felt like a battleground, and the battle had just begun. Chapter 3. The Cold Truth. The wind howled through the cracks in the barn door as John huddled inside, his breath forming small clouds of steam in the cold air. He had spent the morning checking the remaining feedstock, organizing it as best he could, and trying to figure out just how long it would last. But as the hours passed, it became painfully clear. There wouldn't be enough. Not even close. The snow had stopped falling for the moment, leaving the landscape covered in a thick, unbroken sheet of white. But the chill in the air was relentless, seeping into every corner of the farmhouse. John stood still in the barn, staring out at the animals huddled in the pens, each one seemingly unaware of the looming disaster that was slowly unfolding. The cows stood close together, chewing slowly on what little grass remained, while the geese waddled in tight circles, looking for food. The pigs, ever the most vocal of the bunch, had fallen silent, lying in the mud in the most dismal manner John had ever seen them. "John?" Emma's voice broke through the stillness, causing him to turn around. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in her heavy coat, her hands clutching the ends of her scarf tightly as if it might somehow keep her warm. "Yes, Emma?" John asked, his voice tired and strained. "Is there anything we can do to stretch it out longer?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for an answer. John hesitated. He wanted to reassure her, to say something that would make everything feel manageable again. But he knew it wasn't that simple. "I don't know," he muttered, rubbing his hand over his face. "I just don't know." Emma stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind her to keep the heat from escaping. "What if we ration it, give them less? Could we do that?" she suggested, her voice soft but hopeful. "We could," John said slowly, his gaze drifting to the empty feed sacks. "But it's not just about quantity. We need better quality feed, something nutritious to get them through the winter. This feed I got from the store, it's not the same. It's old. I can tell by the smell, the way it crumbles." Emma's face tightened. She had been noticing it too, the lack of vitality in their animals, the sluggishness, the dullness in their coats. She watched the cows shuffle slowly in the barn, their eyes dim and tired. Their health was already beginning to deteriorate, and she feared it would only get worse if they didn't find a solution soon. "What are we going to do, John?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "If they don't have enough to eat, they'll get sick, and we can't afford to lose them. Not now." John's chest tightened at the thought. They couldn't afford to lose any of them. Their animals weren't just a source of income. They were their life. Emma had always said that the farm was their true legacy, the one thing they could leave behind. The thought of watching it all fall apart, of losing their livestock, was unbearable. "I'll try again," he said finally, his voice resolute. "I'll head back to town. There has to be something we can do. I won't let them go hungry." Emma nodded, but there was a deep sadness in her eyes that John couldn't ignore. She had lived through enough storms to know that hope didn't always mean a solution. Still, she wasn't one to give up. Not easily. Not ever. "Be careful," she said, her hand resting briefly on his arm before she turned back toward the house. "The weather's getting worse, and we're running out of time." John watched her go, her figure disappearing into the house as he stood alone in the barn, surrounded by the quiet of the animals. He felt a weight on his chest, a pressure he hadn't known in all the years he had worked this land. Something about this felt different. He could sense it in the air, like the calm before the storm. As he stepped outside, he was met with a heavy gust of wind, the snow beginning to fall again in thick, sharp flakes. The cold bit at his skin, but he hardly noticed it as he made his way down the narrow path toward town. He pulled his coat tighter around him, his boots crunching in the snow as he walked, determined to find a solution. There had to be a way to get more feed, more nutrition for the animals. He refused to let them suffer, not after all they had been through together. The town was quiet as he walked down the main street, the usual hum of activity muted by the snowstorm. The bakery had its lights on, but there were no customers in sight. The general store was closed, the windows fogged with the warmth inside. It seemed as though the entire town was bracing for something, holding its breath as winter crept closer. John's heart sank when he reached the feed store. There were no lights on inside, and the door was locked. He knocked, but there was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. A sense of unease settled over him as he stepped back and looked around. The town felt empty, as if everyone had already known something John had not yet understood. He stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do next. That's when he noticed a figure coming toward him, a familiar face in the midst of the storm. It was Tom, the local farmer who lived a few miles down the road. Tom had always been helpful to John, and the two men had shared many early mornings and long nights tending to their land. "Hey there, John," Tom called out, his voice carried by the wind. "I saw you standing out here. Thought you might need some help." John smiled faintly, relieved to see a friendly face. "I could use some help, Tom. I'm looking for feed, but the store's closed, and I'm running out of time." Tom's face fell when he heard the urgency in John's voice. "The store's out," he said, shaking his head. "They've been running low for weeks now. There's just no supply coming in." John's heart sank. "What about your farm, Tom? Do you have any extra? I can pay you for it, whatever you need." Tom looked away, his face drawn with concern. "I wish I could help, John, but we've been in the same boat. I got a bit left, but not much. Not enough to share." John's frustration mounted, his mind racing. "So what do we do? We're all in trouble if we can't get proper feed. The animals won't make it through the winter like this." Tom paused, his eyes narrowing. "There's a farmer in the next county over, Fletcher. He might have some stock left. I've heard he's got a pretty good supply, but you'll have to drive a bit to get there." John's hope flickered. "Where is he?" "About an hour's drive. You'll want to leave before the storm gets worse," Tom advised. "It won't be easy, but it might be your best shot." John nodded, grateful for the information. "Thanks, Tom. I'll head out right now." As Tom turned to leave, John felt a renewed sense of determination. He would get that feed no matter what it took. The storm might be coming in stronger now, but he couldn't afford to let it stop him. His animals were depending on him. He made his way back to the truck, his heart pounding in his chest. The drive would be long, but he had no other choice. The days ahead were uncertain, but one thing was clear. He couldn't let anything stand in the way of getting what his animals needed. As he drove through the snowstorm, the world around him blurred into a mass of white, the road barely visible beneath the thickening snow. He didn't know what awaited him at Fletcher's farm, but he knew this journey was the first step toward finding a solution. The storm outside may have been growing fiercer, but inside John, the fire of determination was burning bright. And no matter what, he would find a way to bring the feed home. For Emma, for the animals, for their life together. Chapter 4. The long drive. John's truck chugged along the snowy road, its tires grinding through the thickening drifts. The weather had worsened since he left the farm, the once gentle snowflakes now swirling violently in the air, stinging his face through the windshield as he peered ahead. The truck's headlights cut through the blizzard, offering little more than a few feet of visibility, and the road was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. He had set out with determination, the idea of reaching Fletcher's farm a small, flickering beacon of hope in the growing storm. The thought of finding enough feed to last them through the winter, to save their animals, was the only thing keeping him going. But the wind howled louder with every passing mile, and a creeping sense of doubt began to settle in his stomach. What if I'm too late? John muttered to himself, tightening his grip on the steering wheel. What if he's already out of feed too? The snow whipped around the truck, and the visibility grew even worse. His eyes were strained, scanning the road in front of him as he drove, but it felt as if the world outside was closing in on him, suffocating him with the weight of the storm. John's mind kept racing back to Emma. She had looked so worried when he left, her eyes full of unsaid words, a mixture of hope and anxiety that seemed to weigh down the air in the house. She had insisted he go, had encouraged him to find Fletcher, but he could see the unease that lingered in her features. She wasn't fooling him. She was as scared as he was. They had lived through so much together, both the good and the bad. But they had never faced something like this. The animals were more than just farm creatures to them. They were their companions, their livelihood, their pride. And they weren't just depending on John. Emma, too, was waiting for him to bring back a solution. A sense of guilt gnawed at him, and the further he drove, the heavier the weight of that responsibility felt. With each mile, the snow seemed to pile higher, the road more treacherous. But he couldn't turn back. Not yet. Not until he knew they had a fighting chance. He reached for the radio dial, hoping to distract himself, but all that came through was static. The signal was being drowned out by the storm, just like the hope that seemed to be slowly fading in his chest. His eyes flicked back to the road, and he squinted against the blizzard, trying to spot any sign of the next turn. The storm had already turned the familiar landscape into a blur of white, and he felt more alone in that moment than he had ever felt on the farm. Suddenly, something caught his eye. A faint glow in the distance, a soft amber light piercing through the storm. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? John slowed the truck, squinting through the windshield. In the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow, was the silhouette of a barn. The farmstead, Fletcher's place. Relief surged through him like a flood, but it was tempered with the nagging thought. What if Fletcher didn't have anything to spare? John steered the truck toward the light, navigating carefully through the snowdrifts. His mind raced. Would Fletcher help? They weren't the closest of friends, but they had known each other for years. Still, it had been a while since they had last spoken. Would Fletcher recognize the urgency of the situation? Would he have enough compassion to part with his own dwindling supply of feed? The truck rolled to a stop in front of the barn, and John sat for a moment, the engine running, the storm beating against the sides of the vehicle. He could feel the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, despite the cold. Taking a deep breath, he threw the truck into park, climbed out, and slammed the door shut behind him. The wind bit at his face immediately, and the snow seemed to pelt him from all sides. He tugged his scarf higher, pulling it over his nose as he trudged toward the barn. The door was slightly ajar, and he pushed it open, stepping inside to the warm, musty smell of hay and animals. Fletcher was there, just as John had hoped. The older man stood in the middle of the barn, adjusting some hay bales, a lantern casting a soft, flickering glow on his weathered face. "John Stevens?" Fletcher said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "What brings you out here in this storm?" John was out of breath from the cold, his voice shaky as he spoke. "I'm looking for feed. I heard you might have some left. The store's out and I've got animals at home. They need it. Please, Fletcher." Fletcher's eyes narrowed as he looked John up and down, then at the truck parked outside, covered in snow. "I see," he said slowly. "You drove all the way out here in this mess. You must really need it." John nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "I do. My stock's running low. I don't know what to do. Emma, she's worried sick. We can't afford to lose any of the animals, not now. If you can spare some, I'll pay whatever you ask. I just need to make sure they're fed. Please." There was a long pause as Fletcher surveyed him, his face unreadable. John felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What if Fletcher said no? Finally, Fletcher sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I've got a bit left. Not much, but enough to get you through a few weeks. I'm not sure what I'll have for the rest of the season myself, but I can't leave you hanging." He gave a small, resigned smile. "You've always been a good neighbor, John. I'll help you out." John exhaled in relief, his whole body sagging as the tension finally drained from him. "Thank you, Fletcher. I don't know what to say. This means the world." "Don't mention it," Fletcher replied. "We're all in this together. If we don't look out for each other now, we'll all be in trouble." John nodded, his mind racing as he watched Fletcher begin to gather the bags of feed. He wasn't sure how long they would make it through with this small supply, but it was better than nothing. And for the first time in days, he could see a glimmer of hope. As Fletcher loaded the feed into the truck, John caught sight of the wind whipping through the barn doors. The storm outside was only growing stronger, but he didn't mind. He had what he needed, and that was all that mattered. When the feed was packed, John turned to Fletcher one last time. "I'll make sure to pay you back as soon as I can, and if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Fletcher waved his hand dismissively. "You're good for it, John. Don't worry about that." With the bags of feed safely secured in the back of the truck, John thanked Fletcher one last time and turned to leave. The snow was coming down heavier now, but the weight in his chest had lifted. He had what he needed. He could get home. As he drove back toward the farm, the wind had turned, pushing against him, but he didn't care. He wasn't thinking about the storm anymore. He was thinking about the animals, about Emma, about making it through. The storm might still be raging, but now he felt like he had a fighting chance. Chapter 5. The Storm Within. The truck struggled against the fierce wind as John made his way back toward home. The blizzard had worsened, turning the once clear road into a churning mess of snow and ice. Each mile felt longer than the last, the visibility reduced to almost nothing as the swirling white haze swallowed everything around him. He squinted into the storm, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. The bags of feed in the back were a small comfort, but the real challenge was still ahead. He had to get home safely, and the farm still needed more than just this temporary fix. There were days, perhaps even weeks, ahead of them where they would need to stretch this small supply to its limits. The pressure of that responsibility weighed heavily on him. John's thoughts kept drifting back to Emma. He could picture her waiting anxiously by the window, watching for his return. He knew how she worried, how she always had her quiet concerns even when she tried not to show them. He'd seen it in her eyes when he left. She wasn't just worried about the animals. She was worried about him, too. A sharp gust of wind brought John back to the present, the truck's tires sliding a bit as it hit a patch of ice. His heart pounded as he corrected the wheel, the sharp motion almost throwing him off course. He glanced quickly out the window, but the snow was so thick now that the horizon had disappeared entirely. It was a good thing he knew this stretch of road by heart. Otherwise, he would have been lost long ago. Minutes felt like hours as the truck crept forward, inch by inch. His body ached from the tension, and his throat was dry despite the cold. He reached into the cup holder and grabbed the last sip of water from the thermos, his eyes flicking briefly to the bags of feed. It was the only thing keeping him going, the only sign that he might yet be able to pull them through. John knew there were bigger challenges ahead than just the snowstorm. Even if he managed to make it home with the feed, there was still the issue of storage. The animals couldn't survive on just this small amount for long. He'd have to figure out a way to extend it, to stretch it beyond what it should last. And then there was the matter of their grain storage back at the farm. Emma had already been noticing some of the potatoes were going soft, and the carrots hadn't stored well this year either. It seemed like every corner of the farm was throwing its own challenge at them. Just the thought of it made his chest tighten. The wind howled outside, but inside the truck, it felt eerily still. His thoughts filled the space where the howling wind couldn't reach, and he realized how lonely it was out here, on the road in the middle of this blinding storm. The landscape was so quiet, so empty, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Suddenly, a sound cut through the silence, the unmistakable thud of something hitting the truck. Startled, John instinctively swerved. The truck's tires slid again, this time a bit more dangerously. His heart pounded as he regained control, his hands tightening on the wheel. There was no room for error now. He slowed the truck to a crawl, glancing out of the side mirror, but saw nothing but snow. It must have been a large snowdrift that caused the impact, but it rattled him nonetheless. The road was more treacherous now than ever. "Just get home," he muttered to himself. "Get home." The minutes ticked by, but the feeling of dread lingered. John had always prided himself on being able to handle any challenge, to find solutions when things went wrong. But now, despite all the years of hard work and sacrifice, he felt the overwhelming weight of something he couldn't control. And that scared him more than anything. As the truck crept closer to the familiar turnoff that led toward the farm, the snow had picked up once more, reducing visibility to nearly zero. The world outside seemed swallowed whole by the storm. He had no way of knowing exactly where the road curved or whether the truck would make it safely up the incline toward the farmhouse. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the headlights of the truck picked up a faint outline ahead, his farmhouse. It was barely visible, but it was there. He had made it. Relief flooded him in a wave, so powerful that it almost made him dizzy. But as he turned onto the farm's driveway, his joy was quickly tempered by something else. Something felt wrong. The barn, usually warm and welcoming with its faint glow from the lanterns, was silent. The animals didn't stir in their pens as they usually did when the truck arrived. The familiar shapes of cows and pigs, geese and ducks, were nowhere to be seen. John stopped the truck in its tracks, his heart pounding. The house stood dark and quiet in the distance. But the barn? It felt like it was holding its breath, too. Without thinking, he threw the truck into park and jumped out, leaving the engine running. His boots crunched against the snow as he made his way toward the barn, his chest tight with anticipation. Was it possible that Emma had gone inside, seeking shelter from the storm, and left the animals unattended? But as he drew closer, John's stomach twisted with fear. The barn doors were open, not just ajar but wide open. His pulse quickened. He rushed inside, his boots slipping on the icy floor. "Emma," he called, his voice cutting through the silent air. "Emma!" There was no answer. His mind raced with panic, and he ran from one pen to the next, shouting, searching, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The pigs were gone. The cows were missing, too. The geese, the ducks, the rabbits. Every single animal had vanished into the night, leaving only the empty, cold stalls. John's chest tightened as he stood still in the barn, the silence ringing in his ears. He could feel the weight of the storm, the pressure of the cold, pressing down on him, as if it were trying to suffocate him. He swallowed hard, trying to clear the lump in his throat. "Where are they?" he whispered to the empty barn. "Where are they?" And then, his eyes caught something that made his heart skip a beat. A trail of footprints, faint but visible in the snow leading away from the barn. His mind raced. It wasn't like Emma to leave the animals without telling him, without securing the barn first. But what if something had happened? What if... Before he could finish the thought, he turned toward the farmhouse. The trail of footprints seemed to lead in that direction. Emma had to be inside. John took a deep breath, swallowing the knot in his throat, and sprinted toward the house, praying that the worst of his fears would not come true. Chapter 6. The Missing Animals. The door of the farmhouse creaked in protest as John pushed it open, his boots dragging snow behind him. The storm outside howled, but the warmth from the fire in the living room wrapped around him like a comforting embrace. He closed the door behind him quickly, his mind still racing as he scanned the room. The house was eerily quiet, but there was no sign of Emma. Emma? His voice trembled despite his best effort to keep it steady. He could hear his own breath, heavy and ragged from the cold, the pounding of his heart in his ears. There was no reply, not even the familiar rustling of her moving about. John's pulse quickened. Where could she be? The house felt still, unnaturally so. He had expected to see her, perhaps waiting by the fire, ready to hear about the feed. Instead, he was met with a silence that made the air feel heavy with uncertainty. His mind flicked to the barn again. Why were all the animals gone? And where was Emma? His eyes darted from one corner of the room to the other, but there were no signs of her. The kitchen was untouched, the table set as it had been before he left. He felt a wave of dread rise within him. With shaking hands, he reached for the old wooden phone on the wall, his fingers frozen as they hovered over the receiver. Should he call the neighbors? Was she in trouble? What had happened? His mind whirled with the endless possibilities, none of them good. He forced himself to take a deep breath, and just as he was about to pick up the receiver, a noise from upstairs caught his attention. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, footsteps. John's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or more frightened. Slowly, he made his way up the staircase, the wooden steps creaking under his weight. Every step felt like it took an eternity. His head filled with images of what he might find. Emma hurt, Emma missing, Emma somehow lost to the storm. As he reached the top of the stairs, he could hear muffled voices. Two voices, faint but distinct. His breath caught in his chest. One of them was Emma's, but the other was unfamiliar. He moved closer to the bedroom door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He paused for a moment, listening closely. Was she all right? What was going on? He couldn't make out the conversation clearly, but there was something in the tone of the voices. Something hurried, something intense. John pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted him nearly knocked the breath out of his lungs. Emma stood at the window, staring out into the storm, her face pale but calm. She was bundled up in layers of sweaters, a thick scarf around her neck, and a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. In front of her, a man stood with his back to John, a familiar figure, Fletcher. "What's going on here?" John's voice broke through the quiet, a mixture of confusion and frustration rising in his chest. Emma turned slowly, her face flushed, but her eyes were tired, distant. "John," she said, her voice soft. I didn't know how to tell you. We've been looking for them." The weight of her words hit him like a ton of bricks, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. "Looking for who?" "The animals," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're gone, John. All of them." John's knees almost buckled under him, his grip tightening on the doorframe to steady himself. He blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of the words. Fletcher shifted slightly to the side, revealing the wooden crate at his feet, which appeared to be full of something. "What do you mean, looking for them? How are they gone?" John stammered, his mind a whirl of panic. "Where did they go? Why didn't you tell me?" Emma sighed deeply, rubbing her eyes. She looked worn out, like she hadn't slept in days. "We didn't want to alarm you, John, but it's not like they just walked off. Something's happened to them." Fletcher stepped forward, his voice heavy with concern. "We found tracks leading off in the direction of the woods. We think someone might have taken them. It's not like the animals to just wander off like that. Something isn't right." John felt his chest tighten with rage. "Someone took them?" His voice was low, barely controlled. "Who would do something like that? Why would anyone take them? His mind raced. Could it have been someone from the neighboring farms? Maybe someone who needed the animals for themselves? The possibility that someone would steal from them was incomprehensible. Emma shook her head, her face pale with exhaustion. We don't know, John, but we couldn't just leave them out there. We've been searching the woods, calling for them. Fletcher's been helping, but it's so cold, and with this storm, we don't even know if we'll be able to find them, or if they're all right. John turned away from her, his eyes darting out the window toward the swirling snow. I don't care what happens, he muttered under his breath. I'm not letting anyone get away with this. Those animals are our livelihood. Emma, our friends. They're like family. They don't deserve this. Fletcher stepped closer to him. We're all in this together, John. I'll help you find them. We'll go out tomorrow, first light, and see if we can track the footprints further. There's still hope, but the storm's going to make things harder. John clenched his fists at his sides, fighting the urge to shout. It wasn't just the loss of the animals that weighed on him now. It was the feeling of betrayal. The helplessness gnawed at him, the thought that someone could take what they had worked so hard for. He looked back at Emma, her eyes filled with worry and exhaustion. You should have told me sooner, he said, his voice softer now. We could have done this together. I didn't know you were carrying this on your own. Emma nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I didn't want to worry you more than you already were. You had enough on your plate. John walked over to her, gently taking her hands in his. We're going to find them, Emma. All of them. And when we do, we'll make sure this doesn't happen again. The storm outside howled as they stood there, silently holding one another. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, of fear, of hope, and of determination. But for now, they were together, and that was all that mattered. Chapter 7. The Path Through the Snow. The morning after the storm, the world outside felt unreal. The snow had settled, leaving the landscape bathed in an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of John's boots against the fresh powder. It was still early, the sun barely rising over the horizon, but he could see that the tracks in the snow leading from the barn to the woods had already begun to fade, swallowed up by the heavy drifts. John stepped outside, his breath coming in puffs of vapor, his eyes scanning the woods. Fletcher had insisted on joining him, though John wasn't sure it would make a difference. The man had said there might be more tracks if they ventured deeper into the forest, but with the storm still lingering, the snow covered everything. Emma stood in the doorway, wrapped in a thick shawl, her eyes fixed on John as he trudged into the woods. He could see the anxiety in her face. She wanted to come with him, but John hadn't wanted her to. He didn't want her to see what he was about to face. Fletcher walked beside him, his expression as grim as John's. If we're lucky, we'll find something, Fletcher said, his boots crunching loudly against the snow. His voice had a hollow tone to it, the kind that comes with the quiet acceptance of bad news. But John couldn't let himself give in to that just yet. They moved deeper into the woods, their path weaving between the towering pines and thick underbrush. The air was colder than it had been the day before, biting at their faces and hands. John kept his head down, focused on each step. It was hard to think of anything other than the animals. Their pigs, cows, and chickens all gone in the middle of the night. It didn't make sense. There was no logical reason for it. No explanation that could satisfy him. The silence around them felt suffocating. They passed a few bushes with broken branches, their leaves coated in ice. John looked down, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of a trail, but the snow was too deep, too fresh to reveal anything of use. He pushed forward, hoping that the path they had seen the day before would lead somewhere, anywhere. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. John's breath grew heavy as the snow began to stick to his boots, weighing him down. His frustration built with each step that led him further into the unknown. He had thought he was prepared for this, prepared for the fight he would have to put up to get his animals back. But it was becoming harder to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. How long do we keep going? John asked, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. His eyes flicked to Fletcher, who seemed just as lost as he felt. Fletcher paused and looked around, his brow furrowed. "We keep going until we find something," he said firmly. "We can't stop now." John nodded but wasn't sure he could go much farther. The forest was beginning to feel like a maze, its towering trees blocking the light, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the distance. It was disorienting, unnerving. The snow had made everything look the same, like they were walking in circles. As they continued, a faint noise reached their ears, a rustling sound coming from somewhere ahead. It was soft at first, like the wind, but then it grew louder, more distinct. John's heart skipped a beat. He motioned to Fletcher, who stopped immediately, raising a hand to signal John to stay quiet. They both stood still, listening intently. The rustling continued, this time followed by a soft bleat. A goat? John's pulse quickened. Could it be one of their animals? A glimmer of hope sparked inside him. "Is that?" John whispered, but Fletcher held up a finger to his lips. They moved toward the sound, carefully pushing aside branches and stepping lightly on the snow. The noise grew louder, and then, around a bend in the trees, they saw it. An old, rusted cage, half buried under a blanket of snow. John's heart sank. It wasn't one of their animals. It wasn't anything alive at all. But as they stepped closer, they saw that it wasn't an abandoned cage either. The scent of something rotting lingered in the air. A faint, acrid stench that made John's stomach twist. The cage was empty now, the rusted bars bent and broken, and its interior was coated with remnants of old, spoiled food. It was a trap, and it had been set a long time ago. Fletcher's voice was low, almost reverent as he crouched beside the cage. "This wasn't put here recently," he muttered. "Whoever did this, they've been preparing for this for a while." John's stomach churned as he looked around the area. The scent of decay hung in the air like a cloud, and it was clear that this had been a place for something much darker than any of them had anticipated. "Who would do this?" John asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Fletcher stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his coat as he straightened. "This isn't just about your animals, John. This is something bigger, and I think we're only seeing the beginning of it." John's blood ran cold. Fletcher's words settled into his mind, bringing with them the heavy weight of a reality John had hoped to avoid. Someone had taken the animals, and whoever they weren't just thieves. They were part of something far more dangerous. A scream tore through the silence, a cry so raw that it froze John in place. His heart stopped for a moment, the sound reverberating through the trees. He turned toward Fletcher, his eyes wide. "It came from the farmhouse," Fletcher said, his voice grim. "We need to get back." Without waiting for another word, John started running. His legs burned from the cold, and his boots slipped on the ice as he pushed himself harder, faster. His mind was racing. Who could it be? What had happened? By the time they reached the clearing where the farmhouse was visible through the trees, they saw the faint glow of the windows, distant, flickering. The scream had echoed from the house, but now it was eerily quiet again. John reached the door first, his hands trembling as he threw it open. The warmth hit him like a wave, but the sight inside froze him where he stood. Emma was standing in the middle of the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. In her hands was a piece of torn fabric, clutched tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. John's mind raced, but it was the smell, sickeningly sweet, like flowers that had decayed long ago, that hit him next. A trail of blood led to the doorway, and at that moment, he knew they weren't just up against thieves anymore. They were up against something far darker. Chapter 8. The Secrets Beneath. The house, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on John. He stood frozen at the threshold, his breath catching in his throat. Emma was holding the piece of torn fabric, her face drawn and pale, her eyes wide with fear. The room seemed to spin for a moment, everything shifting in a blur as John's heart raced in his chest. "Emma, what happened?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. He could hardly believe the scene before him. The bloodstains on the floor, the trail leading to the doorway, none of it made sense. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She looked down at the fabric in her hands as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. I don't know, John. I don't know what's happening. I just heard something. John stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room, trying to make sense of what had occurred in his absence. The blood, dark and sticky, was fresh, leading directly to the back door where Emma must have found it. She must have been the one to follow it, to find what they now knew lay just outside. Something violent, something cruel. Emma, John said again, his voice firm yet gentle, you have to tell me. What did you see? Her eyes filled with tears as she choked on a sob. I went out to check on the animals, she started, her voice faltering. I thought, maybe they'd come back, or maybe they needed something, I don't know. But when I opened the barn door, I saw them, all of them lying there. The pigs, the goats. They were all dead, John. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to stifle a cry, but it broke free. And the blood, so much blood. I thought maybe I could save one, but it was too late. Whoever did this. They were already gone by the time I got there. John's chest tightened as the realization settled over him like a weight he couldn't lift. The animals were dead, and the blood wasn't just from a struggle. It was an execution, precise and cold. His eyes darted to Emma's hands, still holding the piece of torn cloth. It was a pale shade of blue, frayed at the edges. What is this? He asked, his voice barely audible. Emma's hands shook as she slowly extended the fabric toward him. I found this in the barn too, she said. It's from a shirt or maybe a coat, but it's not ours. I'm sure of it. It wasn't one of the workers. None of our neighbors would do something like this. John took the fabric in his hands, his fingers brushing against its rough edges. He didn't recognize it, but there was something familiar about it, a sense of dread that settled in his gut as he held it. The silence in the room was deafening, filled only by the distant creak of the wind outside and the sound of Emma's ragged breathing. He closed his eyes, trying to piece together the fragments of the puzzle. This wasn't just random violence, it was calculated. Someone had come for their animals, and they'd taken everything with ruthless precision. But why? We need to get the sheriff, Fletcher said, breaking the silence. He had been standing in the doorway, waiting for John to make a move. We can't handle this on our own. We need help. John didn't respond at first. He couldn't. His mind was clouded with the image of the lifeless bodies of the animals, their eyes staring into nothing. Emma was shaking now, her hand clutched around his. He could see the fear in her eyes, the panic in her chest. But there was something more, something beneath her fear that unsettled him even further. Was it guilt? Regret? Or was it the realization that they were in way over their heads? I'll go, Fletcher said, his voice urgent. We can't let this slide. Could be too late by the time you get back. John finally nodded, his face a mixture of rage and sorrow. Fine, he said, the word sharp. Go. Tell the sheriff. Tell him everything. But if anyone asks, we're staying here until we figure out what's going on. Fletcher hesitated for a moment before he left, disappearing into the snowstorm without another word. John watched him go, his thoughts racing. What do we do now? Emma asked, her voice hollow. John turned to her, his heart aching for her. She had seen the worst of it already, had faced the horror without him there to protect her. She didn't deserve this. No one did. He took her hand, his grip strong despite the storm of emotions inside him. We find out who did this, and we make them pay for what they've done. We won't rest until we get to the bottom of this. But even as he said the words, doubt crept in. How could they possibly track down the people who had done this? They were isolated here in the middle of nowhere. Who would help them? And what if the worst was yet to come? The hours that followed were filled with quiet, tense waiting. John cleaned the blood in the barn, but it didn't make the place feel any less wrong. Emma helped where she could, but it was clear she was struggling with the horror of the situation. She was no longer the woman who had spent her days caring for the animals, tending to the garden, and nurturing the life around them. Instead, she was someone broken, someone who had seen the worst of humanity in a single instant. As the sun began to set and the wind outside picked up again, John found himself alone in the kitchen, staring at the walls. The stillness was unbearable. He couldn't stop thinking about the bloody scene in the barn, or the strange piece of fabric that now lay on the table in front of him. What could it mean? Why had they been targeted? Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. John stood up quickly, his heart leaping into his throat. He wasn't expecting anyone. Not in the middle of a storm. The knock came again, harder this time, urgent. He opened the door, and there stood Fletcher, his face pale, his eyes wide with something between disbelief and terror. "John, you need to see this," Fletcher said, his voice strained. John's blood ran cold. The terror in Fletcher's voice sent a wave of dread over him. "What is it?" John asked, his stomach twisting. Fletcher stepped aside, revealing something in his hands. A photograph, one that would change everything. Chapter 9. The photograph. John stared at the photograph in Fletcher's trembling hands, his heart pounding in his chest. The image was grainy, its edges curled as though it had been handled too many times, and the corners were torn, worn down by some unseen hand. The photo showed a group of men, their faces obscured in shadow, standing in front of a barn. But it wasn't just any barn. It was theirs, the one they had worked in for decades. And the men, there was something about their presence that chilled John to his core. Fletcher's voice trembled as he broke the silence. "I found this at the sheriff's office. It was tucked into one of the case files, the ones about missing livestock from the surrounding farms. They're connected, John." John's mind raced, his thoughts tangled in a knot of confusion and dread. "What do you mean, connected? Who are these men? And why is this photograph here?" His voice was sharp, desperate for answers. Fletcher's face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and fear. "I don't know, but I'm sure of one thing. These men have been stealing livestock from farms around here for years. The sheriff had been investigating them for a while, but something went wrong. The case was closed, no leads, no arrests. And now, with your animals gone, I think we're dealing with more than just theft. These men are dangerous, John." The words hung in the air, settling into John's mind like a cold weight. Dangerous. The men in the photo weren't just ordinary criminals. They were organized, methodical, and they had been operating right under their noses, taking what wasn't theirs for reasons unknown. But what did they want with the animals? And why had they chosen John and Emma's farm? John felt his knees go weak as the enormity of the situation began to sink in. The photo, tucked away in the sheriff's files, hidden from view, had to be a clue. A piece of the puzzle that, once put together, could reveal the truth. But it also posed a terrifying question. If they had been stealing from other farms, why hadn't anyone stopped them? Why hadn't anyone been able to trace them? Fletcher set the photograph down on the table, his face grim. "We need to find out who they are, John. We need to track them down before they can do anything else." John nodded slowly, his mind still spinning. He wanted to believe there was a way to fix this, to somehow restore the sense of normalcy they had lost. But the more he thought about it, the more it became clear that things had already escalated beyond their control. The animals, the blood, the photograph. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something far more dangerous than either he or Emma had realized. "We can't do this alone," John said, his voice thick with determination. "We need more help. We'll go to the sheriff. If anyone can find out who these men are, it's him." Fletcher nodded in agreement, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the photo again. "I'll take it to him, but be careful, John. We don't know what we're dealing with here. If they're connected to other farms, this could be much bigger than we realize." John took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had always been a man of action, someone who faced challenges head-on. But this was different. This wasn't just about crops or animals. It was about something far darker, a hidden threat that had been lurking right under their noses. As Fletcher turned to leave, John reached out, grabbing his arm. "Fletcher, whatever happens, we need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. We can't let them hurt anyone else." Fletcher's face softened for a moment. "I know, John. We'll figure this out, but we have to be smart about it. This is bigger than any of us. John watched him go, the door closing behind him with a soft creak. He turned to Emma, who had been standing silently in the doorway, her face a mixture of worry and disbelief. Her eyes were locked on the photograph on the table, her hands trembling. "Emma," John said softly, his voice full of concern, "I know this is hard to understand right now, but we're going to figure it out. We'll get through this together." Emma nodded, but her expression was distant. She wasn't sure she believed him anymore, and John couldn't blame her. The picture in front of them, the lives lost, the fear that now clung to their home. It was almost too much to process. John stepped closer, gently taking her hand in his. He didn't have the answers she needed, but he had something else: determination. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to get them through whatever came next. The next few days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Fletcher returned from the sheriff's office with little news, the investigation stalling due to a lack of solid leads. But John wasn't ready to give up. He kept going over the photograph in his mind, retracing every step of the mystery in an attempt to find some clue, some indication of what had happened. Emma kept busy around the house, though John could see the weight of the events in her every movement. The spark in her eyes, the one that had always made their small farm feel like home, had dimmed. The joy she had once taken in tending to the animals was gone, replaced with a kind of hollow, weary resignation. One afternoon, as John sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the bleak winter landscape, a faint sound broke through his thoughts, a low, guttural growl. Fletcher's dog, Baxter, was on the front porch, his ears perked, his hackles raised. John frowned, stepping toward the door. He didn't know what he was expecting, but the unease in the air was palpable. When he opened the door, he was met by the dog's frantic barking and the unmistakable scent of something burning in the distance. "Emma," John called, his voice rising with alarm. "Get back inside." He grabbed the dog's leash and rushed out into the yard, but his feet faltered when he saw it. Smoke rising from behind the tree line, a faint orange glow casting eerie shadows across the snow-covered ground. Someone had set something on fire. It didn't take long to figure out where the fire had started. At the far edge of the property, just past the old shed, a pile of hay and dried brush was burning. It was small now, but it would spread quickly. And if it did, there was nothing between the fire and the barn, nothing to stop it from reaching the animals. John's heart raced. He had no idea who was responsible for this. But one thing was certain: they were playing a dangerous game now. Someone was sending a message. Chapter 10. The Final Reckoning. The fire spread faster than John had anticipated. What had started as a small flame licking the dry brush in the distance was quickly growing into something much more menacing. His heart hammered in his chest as he ran toward the blaze, Baxter at his heels, barking anxiously. He knew the risk. The fire could easily consume the barn, the hay, everything they had worked for in an instant. The wind was picking up again, carrying the smoke toward the barn, threatening to turn his worst fears into reality. "Emma," he yelled, his voice strained. "Get inside the house. Stay there. Now." But she didn't answer. He didn't have time to worry about her right now. His only focus was the fire, the one thing that could devastate everything they had left. The animals, the life they had built. It all felt as if it was slipping through his fingers. John reached the fire, grabbing a nearby shovel to start scooping dirt and throwing it onto the flames. His muscles screamed in protest as he worked to contain the fire, but the smoke stung his eyes, and his lungs felt as though they were being seared from the inside out. The wind was unrelenting, sending the embers swirling into the air like sparks from an inferno. With every scoop of dirt, the fire seemed to grow larger. It was like fighting a force of nature, one that would not be tamed. And in the back of his mind, a terrible thought began to take shape. What if this fire wasn't just an accident? What if it was meant to distract him? What if it was a signal, a warning that the people who had already destroyed his animals were now coming for everything else? But why the fire? Why not finish the job they had started? The answer lingered just out of reach, as elusive as the wind itself. As he worked, His thoughts kept drifting back to the photograph. The men in the shadows, their faces blurred but unmistakable in their intent. The animals, the fire, the stolen livestock. It all felt connected, as though the pieces of a puzzle were beginning to click into place. But who was behind it all? And why had they singled out John and Emma? Just then, John heard a voice behind him. "John!" Emma's frantic call cut through the thick smoke, and he spun around, his heart dropping into his stomach. She was standing at the edge of the yard, her face pale and streaked with tears. "John, there's someone in the barn. Someone's inside the barn." John's blood ran cold. He dropped the shovel, his heart racing, and sprinted toward the barn, every muscle in his body screaming as he pushed himself harder, faster. Emma's words echoed in his ears. Someone inside the barn. His mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. What were they doing? Were they after more than just the animals? When he reached the barn, the door was slightly ajar. The smell of smoke and charred wood filled the air, and John's instincts screamed for him to be cautious. But there was no time for hesitation. He pushed open the door, stepping into the dim interior. The flickering light from the fire outside cast eerie shadows on the walls. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. It was quiet, too quiet. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind a stack of hay bales. John's breath caught in his throat as the man stepped into view, his features hidden by a dark hood. The stranger's face was obscured, but his body language was unmistakable. He was the one behind the destruction, the one responsible for the deaths of the animals, the one who had set the fire. "Who are you?" John demanded, his voice low and steady despite the fear that gripped him. "What do you want?" The man said nothing at first, only watching John with an unsettling calm. Then, in a voice that sent chills down John's spine, he spoke. "You've lost, old man. This place, it's already gone." John's heart sank as the man took a step closer, the shadowed outline of his face still hidden. "You think you can stop us? You think you can stop what's already been set in motion?" John's hand clenched into a fist at his side. "I'm not going to let you destroy what's left of my life. Whatever you're trying to do here, it ends now." The man's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile if not for the coldness in his eyes. "We're not here for your farm, old man. We're here for something much bigger." Before John could react, the figure lunged toward him, knocking him backward into a pile of hay. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke, and for a moment, everything went dark as John's head hit the hard ground. Dazed, he tried to shake off the disorientation, struggling to focus through the fog that clouded his vision. When he opened his eyes, the man was gone, and the barn was eerily silent once more. The smoke billowed in from the open door, suffocating him. But it was the sudden realization that the stranger was no longer there that terrified him the most. John stumbled to his feet, his heart racing as he scanned the barn. The fire outside was growing larger, consuming everything in its path, but the intruder, whoever he was, had disappeared, and so had the purpose behind his attack. Emma appeared at the door of the barn, her eyes wild with fear. "John, we have to get out of here. The fire's too big. We'll lose everything." He nodded grimly, too shaken by what had just happened to argue. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the door, but before they could step outside, a familiar voice rang out. "Hold on, you two." It was Fletcher, coming from the edge of the yard, his face drawn in concern. "The sheriff's on his way. I found something out. Those men, they're part of a larger operation. They've been going after farms like yours for years, taking everything they can, then selling it off in secret. But we've got them now. They won't get away with it." John's chest tightened as he processed the news. "You're sure?" Fletcher nodded. "We've got proof. The sheriff's team is on it. We'll stop them. You've done your part, John. Now let's get out of here before it's too late." But even as he said the words, the fire raged behind them, eating away at the last remnants of John and Emma's old life. They ran together, hand in hand, toward the safety of the house, the wind howling around them, the sound of crackling flames filling the air. As they reached the house, John turned back one last time to look at the burning barn. It was still standing, but the damage had been done. The fire would take everything, everything but the one thing they could never lose. Hope. We'll rebuild, John said quietly, his voice firm with conviction. We'll rebuild, Emma. And this time, we'll make sure no one ever takes what's ours again. And in that moment, as the smoke rose into the sky and the flames continued to lick at the darkness, John knew that they were not alone in this fight. They had the sheriff's team now, and they had something far stronger than fear. A resolve that no fire, no threat, could ever extinguish. Epilogue. As the days passed, the fire that had ravaged the farm became a distant memory, though the scars remained. With the help of the sheriff's office and the community, John and Emma rebuilt their home and their livelihood. The stolen animals were recovered, and those responsible for the thefts were caught and brought to justice. The farm slowly began to return to its old rhythms, the quiet hum of daily life taking over once more. But John and Emma knew that they had weathered a storm far greater than any they could have imagined. They had lost much, but in the end, they had gained something far more valuable: the unwavering strength of their bond, and the promise of a future built on hope, not fear. They continued to care for their animals, tending to the garden, and enjoying the simple pleasures that life had to offer. And as the seasons changed, so too did their lives, stronger, wiser, and forever changed by the challenges they had faced together. The end.